Folks. In this video, we're going to break down the divisions and approaches to biopsychology. So biopsychology is part of neuroscience, and then we're going to have parts of biopsychology. And the textbook that we've been using, Benella and Barnes, um, describes six or names six of these divisions. And you're going to notice that the names are a bit hard to remember because there's going to be a lot of overlap in what it seems like they mean. And so it really is just going to be a matter of trying to match the term with the definition and working at trying to remember that. And the reason we use these terms is you're going to see people describe themselves or their research in these different areas. And it's going to sound like they're all saying the same thing, but there are some important differences. So when we talk about neuropsychologists, what they do is actually quite different from um, psychophysiologists or cognitive neuroscientists. Their work in biopsychology is quite different, even though the names sound pretty similar. So we're going to walk through each of these and then um, take some time, flashcards, answering questions, that kind of thing, to try to differentiate these the best way that you can. So the first division is physiological. Now, physiology, right, is the function of your body, right? So anatomy is the structure, physiology is the function. So physiological psychologists make sense, measure or manipulate the physiology, the function of the nervous system. So they see how it's functioning, either by recording or by manipulating, by damaging the nervous system. Typically, they're going to do this with lab animals, like rats or other animals, because they can get into the brain of the animals and manipulate or measure those brains. Now, it is possible to directly measure the nervous system of humans if you have access to their brain. Maybe you're doing brain surgery for some other reason, that kind of thing. But most of the time, this is going to be animals. So we'll get graphs that look like this. We'll have devices that drop down into the brain like this, and graphs that look like this, where we're really measuring the function of the brain. Typically, this is what we call basic research. We want to know how the brain functions under different scenarios. We're not necessarily trying to apply this to solve some problem. Okay, so this is physiological psychology. Next up, psychopharmacology. So some people who are biopsychologists might really focus on psychopharmacology. And if you know what a pharmacy is, you should be able to remember what this is, right? So they're going to study the drug effects of psychology. Now, most of the time when we're studying drugs, these are going to be applied questions, right? We're trying to solve some problem by developing and testing, analyzing, and looking at the drug effects on the nervous system. Neuropsychology is our third division. So neuropsychology focuses on brain damage or brain disorders. Okay, so we're not measuring the normal functioning of brains, and we're not manipulating with drugs to treat disorders in neuropsychology. In neuropsychology, we're diagnosing and analyzing and studying brain damage and disorders. Okay. Oftentimes these are individual cases. So, like this is Phineas Gage here, who had a railroad spike through his frontal lobe. You probably learned about him in Intro to Psych, and we'll come back to him later in the semester. But his case told us a lot about the functioning of the frontal lobes. Right. This is neuropsychology because we study the psychology of his neural damage. Okay. Um, in applied research for doing testing and treatment of like epilepsy, that sort of thing, you might see a neuropsychologist. So if you have a child who's having some seizures, which is really common in childhood, you might take them to a neuropsychologist who would study their symptoms and also maybe measure their individual symptoms. Okay, so this is neuropsychology. Number four, psychophysiology. You'll see these names are overlapping, right? So instead of physiological psychology, which we tends to use animals, is very invasive, this is psychophysiology. Okay. So I know it's confusing. In psychophysiology, this is actually non-invasive for the most part. So we're going to do physiological recording on the outside, typically of humans. Okay. Measuring muscle tension in your facial muscles, for example, here to get at emotions. Measuring eye movements with an eye tracker and how dilated your pupils are because you might be stressed out or you might be thinking hard, your pupils dilate. Um, Skin conductance, if you're sweating, EEG signals, heart rate, all of that. Physiological recording on the outside. So I'm not dropping an electrode into your brain. That would be physiological psychology. I'm measuring externally physiological processes that relate to psychology. Interestingly, with physiological psychology or sorry, with psychophysiology, one of the things that you can do is actually see some evidence, some physiological evidence of schizophrenia, and this is some older demonstration here that your book talks about, but it seems like eye movements in many cases, not every case, right? In many cases, eye movements are smooth for people without schizophrenia and then have these kind of non-smooth, these kind of disjointed movements in people with schizophrenia. And so there might be physiological evidence. I don't have to get into the brain necessarily, physiological evidence of neurological differences. Next up. Cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is one of the newest divisions, mostly because the technology is the newest. And in cognitive neuroscience, I'm trying to get at your thinking. Like, what are you thinking in your mind? And it's always been really hard to get at your internal thoughts, right? Because they're your thoughts, right? And so if I want to measure that, I'm going to need some sort of a signal of what your brain's doing when you're thinking those things, when you're having a memory, when you're having empathy, when you're speaking language, when you're hearing language, right? What is going on in your brain when that's happening? Okay. There's a few different ways cognitive neuroscientists do this. One of them is by manipulating through stimulation. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So they pump a magnetic pulse to the outside of your head, and it briefly either kind of turns off or turns on a part of the brain. And if I turn on that part of the brain, you might say I do it back here, you might see things. If I turn off that part of the brain, you might not see things, all right? This is a visual center. Um, or I'm sure you're aware of functional brain imaging like fMRI scans. So these scans here are part of cognitive neuroscience. I'm having humans think about things, do a cognitive task of some kind, and then measuring what's going on in the brain. The final division of biopsychology is called comparative psychology. And this one's going to make a lot of sense because we're comparing things, right? So we're going to be comparing humans and non-human animals. Okay. So I'm going to be comparing what humans do psychologically to what dogs do psychologically, or to what dolphins do psychologically. And we're looking for what's different and also what's common. So, what's similar in the way that humans and dolphins think or behave or feel. Okay. And one of the big questions we're trying to answer here is something about the function of behaviors. Okay. So, if a behavior or an emotion is common for me and for most animals, then there must be a general function, right? That's good for all of us. But if there's something that I do, but that um, bees don't, and something that bees do and I don't, something different about our psychology, then there must be something different about the functionality that's functional for them and not so functional for me, where our situations are different. So we can study the function of psychology for different species and different environments and that sort of thing. So these comparisons, biological based on biological categories of different species can help me um, answer some of those questions, can tell us something about why different things evolved, or maybe there's genetic differences between me and another species that might explain why I do this and you don't, that kind of thing. Okay, so let's back up real quick and look again at those six divisions. Okay, so these are the six here. You'll be expected to When given a description of what somebody does, identify which division they may be a part of. Okay? And ultimately, the point here is that biological psychologists do a lot of different types of research. So some biopsychologists are working with dolphins, and some of them are dropping electrodes into rats' brains. Some of them are um, studying people with brain damage and trying to help them with their symptoms. So it's a lot of different things. One thing that just came up, right, is that we do a lot of research with humans and we do a lot of research with non-humans. And it's important to think about what the pros and cons are of doing that kind of research. So, the advantage of using humans, of course, is that humans can tell you what they're thinking and what they're feeling, their psychology. They can report their subjective experience. They can also follow directions. So if I want to have you read, I can just tell you to read, and then you'll read. Those are your directions. Animals are a little more difficult to you have to train them to follow directions, and they can't tell you what they're thinking. And they use a human brain. So if we're studying human psychology, why not study the human brain, right? Humans are also less expensive. I don't have to raise a child their whole life to study them in my psychology lab. I probably shouldn't, right? But for animal research subjects, I do have to raise them up and keep them in housing, right? So animal subjects are actually more expensive than humans. So why use non-human animals at all? Well, number one is that they're simpler. So here's a squid who has a giant axon, a part of a neuron, and it's a really simple neural system sending one giant axon back to control the siphon at the back. Okay, there's actually one on either side, but it's a really simple nervous system going on here. So if I want to study how an individual neuron works, I can study this giant axon that you can literally like, pick up with your finger. Okay, so human nervous systems are incredibly complicated. So studying one neuron in a human is going to be really difficult. We can also do the comparative approach, right? So I study dolphins because I want to compare them to humans. How are they different? How are they similar? And then also, a lot of people have fewer ethical quandaries with studying animals in some of these ways. If I want to drill into a brain, cause damage to a part of the brain, and see what happens, because I've got hypotheses about it. People tend to be more okay doing that with animals than with humans. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but that tends to be one of the reasons why we might use non-human animals if we want to see, say, the effects of a virus on the brain and on psychology, we would be hesitant to infect a human with that virus to study those effects. But people may be more likely to infect an animal who's susceptible to the same virus to study those effects. So that would be one reason that people use animal research instead. Okay. And then the last couple slides here, you can kind of look at these on your own, is thinking about how we deal with the ethics of non-human research. Um, there are ethical standards for non-human research. There are boards that review the ethics of research with animals, and they tend to balance risks and harms. And when thinking about those ethics, the considerations really are how much harm are you willing to accept? Are you okay with doing research that explicitly causes harm to animals? And then thinking about the balancing of that harm to the benefits that we might get from the research. Okay, so that's how these boards tend to do things, that harm can be acceptable as long as the benefits are high. But if the benefits aren't likely to be high, then we may not approve research that harms animals. Okay. Additionally, there may be reasonable alternatives. So if you can do this without causing harm, then the board might not. Okay. So that's going to be it for chapter one. And we'll see you next time for chapter two.